Welcome to the second module of BAAS 3020, where we're going to continue to look at the process of inquiry. In this module, in this module, you're responsible for reading both the introduction and chapter 1 of our textbook Curious. Inside of Canvas for this module, there are a number of reading assignments and videos, systematically asking questions, inquiry components, why we make bad decisions, what motivates us, and then there's additional materials including some reading on inductive and deductive reasoning, and 2 videos, one on research types and one on how not to be ignorant of the world. The assignments this week, you have another quiz due, and remember that the quizzes are focused, they're really accountability to ensure that you go through all the materials. They're multiple choice, typically with a question from every single learning material. You have the beginning of your survey project, which goes throughout the entire course, and you need to create your group contract. Then you need to, we also have discussion assignments running through this course where each of you are going to be a leader and a participant each week, and you need to divvy up the leader responsibilities by date and discussion, so that needs to be done this week as well. Okay, so that's kind of an overview of the materials and assignments for this module. Sorry, I keep saying week instead of module, depending upon whether you're a full semester 16-week or you're a shorter course. The modules may not correlate to a week. Okay, if you're in a shorter course, you typically have 2 modules per week. If you're in a normal semester, you have 1 module per week, so module 2 would be week 2 in a full semester course. I wanted to briefly talk about the group discussion assignments, mainly because they can come up really fast. And so basically, you're in a group, and you're going to have multiple opportunities to participate in discussions about the reading materials that we're doing, specifically the text reading materials that are due for a module or multiple modules. And this is the schedule for each week that we're doing this, okay? So on Monday evening, the initial post is due. This is from the leader. By Thursday evening, every member of that group should have responded to that initial post. By Friday evening, the leader is to give feedback to each person in the discussion, or to try to help people go deeper. And then by Sunday evening, all of the participants need to have additional responses. So this is an ongoing conversation for the week. Okay, it's important that you, when you're doing your group contract, that you focus on these discussions and make sure that you have all of your leaders assigned by date, because this starts pretty quickly. Okay, now there are dates in here, but you need to not look at this PowerPoint and pick these dates because this may not be for your class. This is just a sample, but when you look into the discussion assignment, at the bottom it says discussion assignment schedule. There's another block in Canvas that says check here for dates, and they're in there as well. So you can see that these happen pretty quickly once the course starts, and so that leader needs to be prepped and ready and ahead of the game, working a module ahead or several modules ahead, especially as we first start this. Okay, so I just wanted to give you that heads up that this is really important, especially for the first discussion, because it comes at you pretty quickly. Our text reading for this week is from the book Curious, and I asked you to read the introduction in chapter 1. It's really important that you read the introduction, and I will admit that I rarely read introductions in books, but this one is a good one, and it not only is good because it's interesting. It started a little slow for me, but it gets really interesting But this provides great insight. This introduction's a bit long. It might even be longer than chapter 1. It provides some good insight into what's coming in the book in a broad way, but it also, to me, provides insight into what the hell we're doing in this entire course. Okay? So I put some quotes here. I'm going to read them. I may elaborate a little bit, but it's really important for you to read this material and digest it, okay? And so most of the reading we're going to try to do, I'm trying not to give you big chunks of reading, but digestible bites, okay? The closer you look at anything, the more interesting it gets, but nobody tells you this. We know that as children, and somehow along the way, I think that gets beaten out of us, mainly by teachers and our education system. Curiosity is unruly. It doesn't like rules. Curious people are looking beyond what is given. And so a lot of society, a lot of communities find curiosity dangerous. An interesting part from here was a section where they were talking about the different moves of knowledge and as in our civilization, and that the current period has been termed the Great Stagnation. That we're less curious that we have been, that there have been less new developments, that if you took technology off the table, that we really haven't moved very far in many different areas. Comment in here that I think is very relevant and contextual for you. The truly curious will be increasingly in demand. Employers are looking for people who can do more than follow procedures. There's a great self-test in here. I encourage you to take it. It kind of gives you a break from the reading. It's very simple. You just, I think, do true, false, and then depending upon which ones you picked, you can kind of score yourself on how curious you are. And I definitely recommend doing this. I did it myself. An interesting thing, another interesting quote from the intro is, by making it easier to find answers, the web threatens habits of deeper inquiry. So because we have information at our fingertips, this may actually, you would think it would aid curiosity, but there's different levels of curiosity, different types of curiosity. And so while it may feed the first type, the diversive curiosity, finding out something new, it kind of quells the other of looking deeper. An interesting thing here, which I had never really thought about, was the idea that how curious is viewed in our society. We've already talked about it being unruly, and so curious people often get in trouble with the law, with authority, and even the way we use language, we may use the word curious, we may label things curious when we really mean they're weird, like that he's acting in a curious manner. So it's outside the norm, but it's also kind of a negative connotation. So I found that really fascinating and interesting and insightful. A great quote from here, you need to understand what feeds curiosity and what starves it, and really that's what this book is about. And hopefully you'll take that to heart, that this isn't just something you're going to read to be able to regurgitate answers, but that this becomes this book about curiosity, this idea about curiosity. You may indoctrinate that into your life and into your habits. How curiosity works, chapter 1. Great examples in here. I remember when I first read this chapter, the two examples that are initially given seem so different to illustrate a similar point. And so he's talking about the example of gun accidents and that how powerful curiosity is. That he talks about this example for very specifically, but in one context he talks about how that children are constantly warned not to touch guns, they're dangerous, etc. But the curious factor of it, overrides their sense of rules and their sense of compliance, etc. But we've already saw in the introduction that curiosity is unruly; it breaks the rules. He talks about the two sides of curiosity. We mentioned he goes deeper into this than in the introduction. One is to explore the new, and the other is to go deeper. To some degree, you might see this in this orange box to the side. He talks about different types of curiosity, that the diversive curiosity is what, what's on the other side of the mountain. We're curious about what's on the other side of the mountain. So it's that look for something new that gets our attention. And then epistemic curiosity is this idea that we want to go deeper, that we want to be more methodical about what we're learning and curious about. And so we want to not just know what's on the other side of the mountain, but we need more knowledge about how do we survive once we get there. He also talks about empathic curiosity, which is curiosity about others' thoughts and feelings. This is a little bit different than diversive curiosity. We may be wondering what people think or feel, but this is going deeper into like why did they feel that, why did they think about it, etc., than just a general wonder about something new. Interestingly, he talks about the pleasure center for finding knowledge is in the same area as romantic love, so that there's something genetic and biological that within humans that has helped us to continually evolve, to continually to grow knowledge, to become more than we were before as a society, as a person, and our knowledge base. That culture makes us adaptable, that the fact that we have language, that the way we live in communities and in tribes and in peoples, that helps the learning and the curiosity because we can learn from others and move much more quickly. That knowledge builds on knowledge, that you first have to be curious about a wheel and have the knowledge of the wheel, then to eventually get to knowledge and to build a car. He also does a great example with Leonardo da Vinci. Okay, now I want you to be sure that while I'm talking about the materials in the course, this is not complete. It is not enough for you to do well on the test. You really need to read these materials yourself and take notes. Take notes. By writing things down, by highlighting and rewriting, you actually retain more of the knowledge. I do use a highlighter a lot, and then I love doing these PowerPoint slides because it takes me back to the materials and it kind of helps me retain some of the information more as well. Our next reading was from something called Systematically Asking Questions. And the idea here is that we just don't want to do diversive curiosity and just ask random questions. What we're talking about in this course is how do we question in a logical way. And really, when we're thinking about that, like what is the question I really want to answer, how do I do it, then what we're talking about is research design or inquiry design. And this is when we're going to think through the entire process. We're going to clarify our question or questions, making sure that we're getting the information we want. We're going to figure out how we're going to gather that information. And then hopefully we're going to draw meaningful and logical and thoughtful conclusions, not knee-jerk. Okay? In this, we talk about variables and attributes, variables being the characteristics, and then knowing more about one or more or the relationships between them, or attributes are characteristics, and then knowing more, we might want to know more about one characteristic or attribute or the relationships between deeper ones. And then variables are broader categories of attributes. And you can see a table there that's in the reading as well up to the right. Theory versus idea or hypothesis. These are three different kind of concepts, and we use them almost interchangeably. And so it's important for you, I think, to know the difference, that a theory is really describing a relationship between variables based on good observations and substantial support. Okay, substantial support. That's really key here. Most of us create an idea or a hypothesis based on observation, but it's not a theory because we don't have the data collected. And this is really related to how we go about reasoning. Okay, deductive reasoning is when we go from when we go from broad to narrow. So we have this kind of theory that says that drinking water is good for you. And then we might want to use deductive reasoning to figure out how much water to drink. We might have a hypothesis that, humans should drink 6 gallons of water a day. Please don't, that will kill you. Yes, you can die from drinking too much water. And so you would start testing that theory, and then, applying it to when you got to someplace where you would say, oh, well, humans should drink a gallon of water a day or whatever. Okay, so deductive reasoning is going from broad to narrow. Inductive reason is kind of going the opposite direction. It's going from narrow to broad. It's moving from a hypothesis to theory. So we observe something and then we think, I wonder if this applies to everyone or every situation. Now, I really want to put a warning here, and this is what's really dangerous about social media. And about all this fake news we hear, is that we get one source of information, one observation, whether from reading or from an actual experiment, etc., and then we make a broad sweeping generalization or theory about it. And this is the dangerous type of reasoning that we have, that we're using inductive reasoning to move from narrow to broad without research, inquiry design, without questioning and at all, and without finding more data to back it up. So, to me, a part of, what's happening in our culture in America is that we're relying heavily on inductive reasoning that isn't cultured, that isn't well thought through, that isn't looking. And so when you think something is true, then that's some kind of inductive reasoning, that you're applying a narrow concept to a broader one. But be careful, because you want to make sure that you validate that. And that's part of moving from hypothesis, this general idea or pattern that you think that you're seeing, into really a theory. And if we all did that, if we all kind of used this kind of research design to move us forward, we would have a lot less dissension and probably a lot less disagreement. It's the inductive. So I really want you to be warned about that. I'm not saying that inductive thinking or reasoning is bad, but be careful how you apply it. And especially when you're trying to move from narrow to broad, you want to find more cases, etc. Another kind of the next material we had was on the inquiry components. Okay, and that when we're building a research or an inquiry process, we want to describe a variable, listing attributes, grouping, and looking for exceptions. We might be counting them. In the example, it uses the education level and then some measure of prejudice. Okay, and so here you're just asking people a survey question. I think it was about years of education, and then they created some kind of parameter, like if you've had less than 5, maybe you're uneducated. If you've had more than 5, you're educated, or some parameter that you set up in your research process. Then you just ask people, you count them, and you do a percentage like you see here. They did the same thing with prejudice and unprejudiced. They figured out a question to assume whether someone was prejudiced or unprejudiced. And notice that what they're doing is they're asking 2 questions of that same pool of 20 people. And then you're going to try to explain how the variables are related. And you can do this with a lot of charts, etc. And I really like the chart that they've used here. I believe this is called a Pareto chart, where you put, a smiley for every answer. And one of the things that it does, you can establish a pattern really easily here. This shows that based upon this one tool, that perhaps, assuming it's a valid tool, a valid survey, that it appears that uneducated people have a greater level of prejudice versus educated. Okay, so what you're doing here is you're looking for patterns. The temporal order is, what comes first. Temp means time, so temporal order is kind of about putting things in order, etc. And causation versus correlation. This is a huge thing in research that when we see two things happening together or often together, we might think that that one thing is causing the other. And this is really hard to prove. And so you have a real warning here about saying that A causes B, that, oh, well, education, um, education reduces prejudice. Well, we can't really make that claim just based upon this one survey tool inquiry experiment. Okay, it's very difficult to link things to causing them. And why is that? Because there may be a lot of other considerations we're not thinking about. Maybe it's whether you grew up in a rural versus an urban environment where you might have been exposed to a lot more people and from a lot different places. Whether you moved around geographically. There may be a lot of different things, and also the type of prejudice we're talking about. Is it religious prejudice? Is it racial prejudice? Is it ageism? So you have to be really careful about this causation versus correlation. Correlation just means that we often see two things together, but we don't know how they're related quite yet. Causation means one thing starts the other. And so we're also going to look at, in this reading, there's about independent and dependent variables. And specifically in a causal relationship, the independent one is what causes the dependent one. So the dependent one is dependent upon the independent one to make it happen. And so there's some great words here that are in that reading as well. Again, I want to caution you that because I've talked about this does not mean you can skip this or skim it. You really want to read these. They're not very long, etc. And I've broken them down into modules so that you have smaller bits of information to digest. An interesting video here. This is a rather long TED Talk. I think it's 15 minutes, but it's interesting about why we make bad decisions. And he talks about this image at the bottom is of a mathematician, Bernoulli. And he talks about this formula about expected value, that we can kind of rate or gauge the value of anything by our perception of the odds of gain, how much will we gain, and then how valuable that gain is to us or to a community, etc. And that's Bernoulli's formula. But the problem is it's difficult to calculate odds, and also it's difficult to calculate the value of the gain. And he gives several reasons for this, comparisons with the past, that our use of personal experience leads us to frequently make bad conclusions, and our comparisons with the possible. The context of comparisons change, so it makes our assessments of value change. Now that's really broad, and Dan Gilbert gives great examples. They're very easy to understand. So sit back, take a break after reading the one before. Sit back. 15 minutes is not long. Turn everything else off. Turn your phone off. Get a coffee, get a tea, get a Coke, get a cocktail, and enjoy the video. Another fun video that we see here. This one moved a little bit fast and was a little bit distracting with the cartoon images. But it's, he starts with this premise that, most of us think that if we get a reward, we will, get more of the behavior we want, or if we reward someone, they'll do more of what we want. And if we punish them, they'll stop doing it, if you're a boss or a parent, etc. He says, but this may not be always true, that in simple tasks it does work, but in complicated tasks it doesn't work. And the definition of those you need to watch to see what he means by simple tasks and complicated tasks. That better performance, especially as we move up the chain of tasks, comes from autonomy, being able to work independently, mastery, becoming better at something, and then making contribution. That there's something altruistic or giving about what we're doing that's benefiting maybe perhaps more than the bottom line. And he says that one of the concepts he has is that when companies detach their profit from a purpose, that people tend to do not perform as well. There's another reading about looking at inductive and deductive reasoning. These are all quotes from it. I don't think I'm going to read them to you. I think you can read them if you want. You can hit the pause button and read them. These are just some interesting thoughts that were in that reading. It's again a very short reading that kind of reinforces these concepts of inductive and deductive reasoning. We have another short video. I don't think this was a TED Talk about exploratory, descriptive, and explanatory nature of research. Exploratory nature was when you observe things and you move this into a description or a hypothesis, you identify variables. And this might be how you try to apply theories in new areas or try to develop a new theory from your observations and descriptions. Descriptive nature explains and provides more information about a topic. It builds on the exploratory nature, but it needs lots of data. And explanatory is nature explains relationships between variables and why things happen, etc. So again, that was a very brief overview. You really need to watch that video, and it's much shorter. Okay, how not to be ignorant of the world. This was a really fun video. Again, it's a little bit long, I think about 15 minutes. Interestingly, it's a father and son presenting team, which I thought was rather cool, and that they're working together, looking at ignorance in the world. Why are we ignorant of what's going on in the world? Our experience is not representative. Our education tends to be past focused. The news media focuses on the shock value. You know what they say, if it bleeds, it leads. Our experience, again, may be, especially as Americans, not everyone in this class is an American, but especially as Americans, we live in a very large country where very few people travel outside of the country. And we don't, because we're such a large country, I always say that we're basically a giant island. We don't pay as much attention to news around the world. Our education tends to be past focused. Teachers do tend to teach the way they were taught, and so it may not be focused on what's happening now and what changes have taken place. This was kind of interesting too. He does this experiment where he asks these surveys, and do the experiment in there. So pause the video when he asks you the questions and just write down what you think. Okay, it's kind of a fun thing to do. I did it, and it was quite interesting. And basically, I'm at the mental level of ignorance of a chimp, which you'll get when you see the video. But some of our common misconceptions, he says, are that most things get worse, where it's quite the opposite. And that's what these images are over here to the left, that most things tend to generalize us. And what he's talking about here is how we can kind of make better guesses based on statistics than based on our misconceptions. We think that this is not the misconception. I think this is the actual correction, that most people are in the middle of a bell curve. So I guess our misconception is that people fall on one end or the other, that most people are worse or most people are better. Again, I think this is the correction, that we need to be first social, then rich. We first focus on social change and then on financial. And that the last misconception is that it's kind of the what do we call it, like not the context but the contrast. This is why if it bleeds it leads. We got to look at it. Sharks are dangerous, right? And so we worry about sharks going to the beach, but it's very rare. Like, more people die in an automobile accident, but we don't panic before we get in the car like we might in an ocean. Okay. And you probably can't see it, but that's a little tiny shark in that magnifying glass. And so he's talking about how we pay all this attention and energy to something that has very little impact on us. Maybe you live in the middle of the country. Here in Dallas area, there is, I don't even know, I guess there might be an aquarium nearby that has a shark in it. But for me to be worried about shark attacks, is ludicrous, because it just, it really has such a small relevance to my life. And what he's talking about here is that um, that we can blow things out of proportion. I guess that's the best